Hello, my dear viewers. This amazing story will be very instructive for you. It is very interesting and beautiful. I wish you enjoy watching it. Susan, as she always did after her conversation with her ex-husband, felt somehow guilty. An absurd feeling, especially when you consider the reason their marriage had broken up. She and Mark aren't strangers. 30 years together is serious. They have a lot in common. A grown married daughter, Jill, a smart and beautiful girl, a wonderful grandson, Matthew, very many warm, funny, and fun memories. Regardless, Susan thought these years were a good time. She sincerely wished Mark the kind of happiness she had, but her ex-husband wasn't having an easy time in his life right now. Susan had no doubt that things would get better for the man in time, except right now her heart was restless for Mark. Today he spoke to his ex-wife in a voice that clearly sounded longing. Mark had called to find out what gift to give Matthew for his approaching 8th birthday. Every year on that day, his loving grandfather gave the boy a tidy sum, which he transferred to an account specially opened for Matthew. But he also made sure to buy him a toy of some kind. He liked to see the joy in the child's eyes. The man himself did not know how to please his grandson. In children's stores, Mark's eyes darted around, so he consulted with his wife, now an ex-grandmother, always aware of Matthew's dreams and hobbies. She often remembered the day she had met Mark. She even remembered that it was Thursday, on the eve of the long May holidays, although to be very precise, they had known each other much earlier. But until that memorable day, she had never really noticed Mark Adams, an unassuming guy from the parallel group. They both studied at the finance, an unassuming guy from the parallel group. They both studied at the finance and economics department, and, of course, they intersected at lectures, seminars, tests. Only Susan attracted other guys, and preferably older than her boys and peers, whose heads were still whistling in the wind. The girl herself at that time had only just transformed from a teenager into a charming and feminine young woman. Susan was a late bloomer. She looked much younger than her 50-something years, which of course was fine now, but back then, as a young girl, Susan had been worried about her childish appearance, her peers flaunting their feminine forms while everyone called her a girl and took her for a girl, and took her for a girl, and took her for a middle schooler. Naturally, boys did not pay attention to Susan. It was a bit offensive, but by the first year, there was finally a noticeable change in a girl. Susan could not rejoice in these changes. She grew taller. She became more feminine and attractive. Guys finally began to look at her, feeling her own feminine strength. Susan blossomed, became more confident in herself. That day, she and her best friend and classmate, Lily, decided to pass the free time, the so-called window between classes in the university cafeteria. Susan had intended to buy her favorite cinnamon buns. She adored them and could devour kilos of them. Her figure was not harmed by such gastronomic cravings. Nay, when did Susan lose this super ability? Now, in order to stay slim, she had to limit herself. But in the cafeteria, the girl was disappointed. Her favorite buns were absent, as well as any other pastries. The students had bought up everything at the last break, and the new batch had not ripened yet. "Here we go," Susan pouted crankily. "The only joy of the day was gone from me, and I would have to chew unleavened salad. Back then, it was almost a rule of decorum for girls to pretend to be spoiled beauties." Thinking back on it now, Susan smiled. It seemed that the more capricious a young person behaved, the more beautiful and attractive she was. So the girls tried their best. It's funny. Mark was in the cafeteria at the time, too, standing in line behind his girlfriends. When he heard Susan and the barmaid talking, he immediately hurried to the exit. Susan knew the rest from his own words. It turned out that Mark was in love with her from the very first day of school. The boy immediately noticed the girl at a general lecture, and since then he looked for her with his eyes everywhere. In the huge classrooms, crowded university corridors, in the huge classrooms, crowded university corridors, in the courtyards of the academic building. He admired her graceful movement, beautiful eyes, dazzling smile, and was very happy when he could hear the happy laughter of young beauty, but openly show his affection a boy did not dare. Susan was so beautiful, so wonderful, and he himself was a frail, unattractive young man, without a penny to his name. Mark was pulled by his mother alone, and they always lived more than modestly. How could such a guy win over a beauty with bottomless eyes and luxurious long hair? True, Mark understood that he had one important advantage over his possible rivals: an uncommon mind. This was recognized by many, first by teachers, then by university professors. Even the most difficult sciences were easy for Mark to grasp. What to hide, he was quick. Thinking clearly presented his thoughts, so the guy had no doubt that someday he would achieve a lot. And so it eventually turned out a few years later. But at that very period of his life, Mark was a poor student, so he did not dare to approach Susan, especially since she almost never stayed alone. Her girlfriends constantly crowded around her. Everyone knows how girls can make fun of guys, especially when they get together in groups. When Mark later shared his feelings and experiences with Tamara, she was surprised. It turns out that from the outside, she looked like an unapproachable cold beauty, behind which there is a line of worthy admirers. But in fact, she had no one then. But many young men paid attention to Susan, but beyond a couple of compliments and light flirting, did not go further. Why? Because when she got to know somebody better, Susan was invariably disappointed. He wanted sincerity, attention, care, interesting conversation. But young men turned out to be kind of boring, selfish, concentrated on themselves. This immediately repulsed the girl, as if a cold shower poured over her every time another admirer showed himself. Susan even began to think that there was something wrong with her because she was attracted exclusively to such people. And then Mark, when he heard that Susan was dreaming of a cinnamon bun, immediately decided to act, forgetting about his own lunch. Mark rushed out of the university. There was a bakery across the street. It wasn't a long way to get there. It would take about 15 minutes just to get to the central building exit. The building was a huge maze, with many stairs and crosswalks, and traffic and crowds of students. And then there was the underpass, and he needed to get there before Susan and her friend left the dining hall, so he could make it. When Mark flew into the dining room with a paper bag from the bakery containing warm cinnamon rolls, Susan and her friend were still sitting quietly at the table, eating salads. Mark had never been afraid because she wasn't like the other girls. She was quiet, modest, kind, good, the kind who wouldn't make fun of him in front of his friend to show her own superiority. The boy took a deep breath and fixed his disheveled hair and headed straight for Susan. Here, he handed her a package. "Your favorite? What is it?" The girl was surprised. And when she realized, she was at first very surprised, and then smiled at Mark. The warm and tender buns, obtained especially for her, told Susan of Mark's attitude better than any words. Susan understood everything. Her heart was flooded with a warm, pleasant wave. The girl suddenly felt special and looked at Mark with entirely different eyes. No, he was still the same puny and unassuming guy, but what a confident look and intelligent eyes he had, and also very beautiful, graceful hands, like a musician. But most importantly, Mark is attentive and caring. He is clearly in love with her, and these feelings are strong and sincere. What more do you need? Isn't that what Susan has been dreaming of for a long time? The delicate Lily tried to leave the young people alone under an invented pretext, but Susan stopped her. She and Mark had plenty of time ahead of them. And so it turned out. Mark and Susan began dating. With each passing day, the girl became more and more glad that the boy decided to approach her. The closer she got to knowing Mark, the stronger her attachment to him became. Mark was sensitive, caring, affectionate, and also very intelligent, yet easy to be with. He was natural, funny, and also had a great sense of humor. He made Susan smile even in her most difficult moments, and that was especially valuable. Mark always came up with something fascinating and unusual. They walked to corners of the city that Susan had never known existed before. No, banal dates in parks, cinemas and cafes were also present, of course. But besides that, there were excursions on city rooftops, exploring old abandoned houses in the historic center, trips to local mountains and waterfalls. And the guy also introduced Susan to interesting people, members of rock bands, young artists, archaeology. Yes, the guy knew how to choose his friends. He had a lot of them, and they all treated Mark with warmth and respect. Life of a girl after she began to meet Mark played with new colors, and Susan liked it very much. Sometimes she had the feeling that before she met him she'd been asleep, living half-heartedly, and only now she woke up and saw the world through completely different eyes. But the most pleasant feeling was the feeling of security. When Susan was near Mark, it felt as if she was securely closed off from all of life's hardships. Mark did everything possible and impossible for her, if necessary. The girl felt it. And one spring morning, Susan suddenly realized clearly that she was expecting a child. Before that, she had had only faint suspicions, but in the morning the girl dreamed of her daughter, small, pretty with blonde curls and piercing gray eyes, just like Mark's. As a matter of fact, Jill had been exactly like the little girl in the dream in her early childhood. Amazingly, Susan still could not find an explanation for this incredible fact. That same day, the girl made an appointment with the doctor. She was immediately admitted. Well, and of course, in the doctor's office, the girl found out what she no longer doubted. Susan was not at all surprised. The close feeling the girl experienced when her hunch was confirmed was a great joy. The world around became somehow brighter and lighter. She and Mark were going to have a baby. It was wonderful, but then have a baby. It was wonderful. But then her head began to turn on, and there were disturbing thoughts. He and Mark were only 20 years old. They were both still studying. Mark worked part-time, of course, as a courier in a large oil company. He had enough money for cafes and entertainment, but he obviously could not support his family. His parents would not be happy. They had set their daughter on it. Her studies and career, and then this. And Mark. How would he take the news? Something inside told Susan that the guy would be happy. Surely he would find a way. Mark was never discouraged or despondent. He was sure that all difficulties were surmountable and problems solvable, and yet the child was a tremendous burden for him, but there was nowhere else to go. Susan told Mark during the break between classes. They stood in the university corridor next to the wide windowsill. People flowed in both directions, but neither Susan nor Mark noticed anything or anyone around them. It seemed to both of them as if at that moment there were only two of them, and as if at that moment there were only two of them on the entire planet. Hearing the news, Mark grabbed Susan and held her close to him, began to stroke her back and hair. The girl was relieved. Mark did not disappoint her. He was not frightened, not upset, did not perceive the future child as a nuisance or a problem. "So what are we going to do about it?" Susan asked, pulling away slightly from her lover. She could see from Mark's eyes that he was already contemplating a plan of action. "What are we going to do about it?" The guy repeated Susan's question with a smile. "We will love, raise, and nurture." The girl smiled. She really liked his words, and so did Mark's reaction. "Where will we live and on what?" A child, after all, is a very responsible thing. Responsibly, Oleg agreed. "So it's time to grow up. Next semester, I will transfer to the correspondence department and get a full-time job at my firm. But not as a courier, but as an assistant economist. I have long been invited." Mark had an answer for everything so quickly and easily, and he couldn't get lost. Mark actually transferred to a correspondence course and got a full-time job in an office. Now his salary was enough for rent and groceries. Of course, they didn't luxuriate, but they didn't go hungry either. Mark also worked part-time as a longshoreman, and he deposited all of his extra earnings into his bank account. Mark was saving up to buy everything the baby needed when the time came. Susan had made a list long ago. Crib, stroller, diapers, undies. Susan and Mark were the first parents of the entire student body. so nothing from their friends went to the baby. Susan and Mark had a modest student wedding. The bridesmaid of honor was, of course, Lily. The friend had really witnessed the birth of the newlyweds' relationship, and she, unlike the other girls, had not tried to make Mark look like a pauper. On the contrary, she had always assured Susan that her boyfriend was a promising young man. Lily was genuinely happy for her friend. How long had they been friends? It was hard to even count. It seemed that Susan and Lily had become close in high school. They had been together more than half their lives. Lily could not believe to the last that Mark did that, even looking for excuses for him. Vera herself was not very happy in her personal life, 4 unsuccessful marriages under her belt. It was no joke, but looking at the couple Tamara and Oleg, Vera was sincerely happy. If it weren't for you, I think happy marriages were just fiction and fantasy. More than once she said, but you have everything perfect. It gives me hope that one day I will do the same. When Jill was born, Susan, like Mark, had to transfer to a correspondence course. There was no other way. It turned out that the baby was taking up all the time and all the attention. It was almost impossible to combine taking care of an infant with the pressure of full-time study. Mark was away at work. Susan herself, as best she could, fiddled with the household and the baby, and you also had to study. No one canceled the session, and the benefits for new parents. Students are not provided. But Susan and Mark coped, supported each other, happy for the success of a little daughter, getting used to be parents and spouses, learning to manage the household. Susan recalled the time as the happiest. They were young, in love. It seemed that there was an interesting, bright life ahead, and of course, a comfortable and peaceful old age, hand in hand. Then the crisis of the 1990s hit. The company where Mark worked had a change of management. The young father of the family lost his job, and therefore the only source of income. Finding a new job in his specialty was out of the question. Everything was ruined. Enterprises were collapsing and closing one after another. The young economist with a university degree, career achievements, and already good experience was left with nothing, but Mark was not averse to dirty work. He worked as a janitor, a loader, a watchman, grabbed at everything that came up, but money, of course, was catastrophically lacking. Meanwhile, Susan's maternity leave was over, and she got a job outside of her field. An economist position, of course, she could not find. The young mother was hired as a receptionist at a dental clinic. The salary was tiny, but it was paid every month without delays, at least some stability. Mark, of course, did not sit idly by. He tried to do business. He borrowed money from acquaintances or took loans from banks. The man was full of ideas, objectively worthy, effective, and profitable. Every decision he made was logically and economically sound. Susan, as an economist, was well aware of this, but Mark was haunted by failure. The situation in the country itself was not conducive to success. High inflation, rampant crime, all these prevented Mark from materializing. Only, as soon as he began to ascend, he fell down. He was upset, of course, but he did not fall into despair and panic. He began to work day and night, almost without sleep or rest. He gave away his debts, which, fortunately, were always small. I thought of a new business plan and started building the business again. And Susan was always there. She supported her husband in all his endeavors. And when he once again admitted failure, she calmed him, hugged him, showed that she believed in him. Many years later, Mark confessed to his wife that her support meant a lot to him. He appreciated it, saw how other wives saw their husbands for the slightest failure, called them names, reproached them, mixed them with mud, and thanked fate for the fact that there was a completely different person near him. And then suddenly another store selling small appliances began to make a profit, at first very small, and then more. Mark nurtured this business like a little child, devoting all his time to the store, developing new strategies. By the way, he often consulted with Susan. Of course, she never worked a day in her profession, but still had a degree in economics. The woman liked her husband to ask her questions and ask her opinion. At such moments, she felt smart and competent. Soon there was so much money in the family that Mark and Susan were able to afford their first apartment, their own. It was a spacious two-bedroom apartment downtown. Susan happily began to furnish it. She still remembered how spirited she felt when she chose the furniture, wallpaper, and decor. Now Mark and Susan did not deny themselves anything. They ate lunch and dinner in restaurants, bought clothes in good stores, and traveled a lot. Her caring parents transferred her to a private school. The monthly fee was quite high, and until recently unaffordable for the family, but it was worth it. A few more years of a contented, prosperous life passed, and now, when Mark had a whole chain of stores, the couple thought about a second child. Before, they could not afford this luxury. They studied, worked, and stretched themselves to the limit in order to stay afloat. Now everything had changed. Both spouses missed having little ones. Jill had turned into a teenager who didn't really need her parents' attention, and now the girl's first priority was her friends and hobbies. The couple understood that this was normal. Mark and Susan were still so young, and to be honest, they hadn't had time to fully enjoy their daughter's childhood years. There was no time. They had to survive then, but with the second child, nothing was working out. Susan and Mark were examined by a reproductive specialist. There was nothing wrong with both spouses in this regard. The specialist recommended avoiding stress, getting more rest, getting positive emotions, and waiting. Susan even quit her job after that. There was a change of management. The staff diluted everything with newcomers. Now being in the workplace wasn't as enjoyable for Susan as it used to be. In recent years, she had worked only to socialize with her beloved colleagues. So now there was nothing holding her back at the dentist's office. The woman visited spas, vacationed at resorts, and lived her life to the fullest. She had everything she needed for comfort and a pleasant pastime, but here's the paradox. She did not feel happy during this golden period. The soul was sad and languid. A woman so wanted to become a mother again and once again see the baby in the arms of her beloved man. On top of all of Susan's health deteriorated. She became quickly fatigued. Dizziness appeared, lost appetite. Dizziness appeared, lost appetite. Mark, seeing the condition of her beloved, signed her up for an examination in the best center in the area. Susan tried to resist. Why would I want to do that? It's just apparently the transition age from youth to adulthood or something like that. I'm so sick and tired of these examinations. Just the other day we were running around to the doctors, and now it's those white coats, tests, hospitals again. I don't want that, Oleg insisted. Then it was about the possibility of becoming parents again, and now it was about your health, and maybe even your life. Of course, Susan gave in. Mark always knew how to persuade. That was partly why he was so successful, especially since the woman's condition was getting worse and worse. It was frightening, and it was hard to see her husband's worried eyes. So Susan went for a checkup after all. It later turned out to have saved her life. Had she delayed the examination another week, Jill might have been orphaned and Mark a widower. The diagnosis the attending physician gave the patient sounded like a verdict at first. Susan felt cold, as if she was crushed by a heavy slab. But then the doctor began to propose schemes of treatment, outlining a bright future and setting her up for success. And Susan decided that she would fight it, especially since she had such a powerful ally, Mark. My spouse alerted the best doctors in the country who were working with the disease. The treatment proved to be long, arduous, and very expensive. Of the next 4 years, Susan spent a total of 3.5 years in hospital. She had to endure more than one surgery, but the woman didn't give up. She had someone to live for, Jill and Mark. Her family visited her as often as they could, but they each had their own lives, their own things to do. Susan understood that. Mark was working so hard at his business, and yet the woman constantly felt the support of her family, and that gave her strength. Susan felt sorry for the lost time. How much in those 4 years had she missed? Not flying with Mark to the sea, not cooking her favorite delicious dinners, not talking heart to heart with her daughter about her girlfriends and boyfriends, but where to go, sometimes lying under another IV. Susan could not believe that just recently she was going to become a mother again. Her life was very different then. She did not appreciate it, took for granted the opportunity to raise and give birth to a baby Susan no longer had. The disease took away the chance of a happy motherhood. But, on the other hand, it was out of the question to survive. And Tamara managed to emerge victorious from the battle with a serious illness. The disease receded, helped by doctors, medicine, surgery, and the faith of her loved ones. Mark and Jill never doubted that everything would end well in the end. How happy did Susan feel when she got out of the hospital? She rethought her life. She realized how petty and frivolous her desires had sometimes been. Now the woman consciously enjoyed every moment of her existence. Jill graduated from high school and went to university. Mark was always away at work, and he had a new hobby: fishing. He used to spend the whole weekend at the lake, pulling on his camouflage suit and high boots, throwing his fishing rods in the trunk, and rushing to his friend's house. Tamara was alone, but loneliness did not weigh on her and did not upset her. The woman understood that each spouse should have their own personal space in life. Moreover, she had her own hobby. Having achieved peace of mind and enjoyment, Susan took up gardening. Within a few years, she transformed the space in front of the house into a fabulous park with paths and a fountain, bright clubs, flowers, garlands, and netting. Guests admired Susan's brainchild. Friends even began to ask her for advice as an experienced landscape designer. The woman loved finding solutions that pleased her and the garden's owners, and in most cases everyone was pleased. Susan was so engrossed in her new hobby, healing and reinventing her life, she didn't notice anything. Mark's love and devotion seemed like something she took for granted. No. Of course, the woman saw that her relationship with her husband had become less warm, but that was normal. Feelings had not cooled down. They had just acquired a different quality. It always happens. Mark was the same, attentive and caring. What else do you need? Life presented one happy event after another. The business kept growing. Jill graduated with honors from one of the top universities, found a great job. There she married a good man, and then she gave her parent a grandchild, a wonderful baby boy named Matthew. It was true that they lived far away, but that was okay. They often came to visit their parents, and sometimes they left Matthew to stay with his grandparents for a few weeks. Those were happy days for Tamara. She had never been able to become a mother a second time, but now she had a grandson. She was now able to give him all the love and tenderness she had not yet squandered. Susan played a lot with Matthew, walked around town with him, showered him with gifts, baked pies and pancakes for the boy, and the little boy reciprocated. Once when Matthew was about 4 or 5 years old, he confessed that his grandmother was his best friend. Susan almost cried at that moment. The emotion came over her. Mark enjoyed being a grandfather too, but he did it in a slightly different way. If Susan cooked Matthew with care and tenderness, Mark taught him how to repair a crane, how to deflect a blow from an enemy, how to assemble complex models from a construction set. When Matthew grows up, you'll take him fishing with you, Susan said with a smile one day. Her husband went fishing periodically, a hobby he became more and more fond of. Mark flinched then for some reason, embarrassed, but Susan paid no attention to her spouse's reaction, and only later recalled that moment many years later. Susan sank into her favorite chair. It's so cozy, so soft, and it also has a great view of the garden. It wasn't Susan's very first creation, a different garden in a very different house, which has also become a woman's home. She had worked on this landscape recently, and it turned out great. Susan loved this garden now even more than the first one, But it still made her sad to think that the house and garden, her and Mark's family nest, now belonged to others. The whole thing was revealed by accident. Oleg came home earlier than usual that day. That the husband was in high spirits was evident at once. Can you imagine? I signed a contract with Alida. From the threshold, he declared. His wife smiled as she greeted him. She knew how long it had taken Mark to get here, and she was very happy for him. It's going to be a whole different life, such prospects, you would know. Mark was bursting with excitement and literally couldn't sit still. Susan herself suggested that he go to a neighbor's house to distract himself, to relax. Harry lived in the cottage across the street from them. Susan was friends with his wife, and Mark often spent long periods of time with Harry. Now he must be anxious to tell his buddy the news. Mark left. Susan was alone again. She was alone again. She was about to go upstairs to read a book, but then Mark's phone vibrated on the table. The caller's name popped up on the screen. Paul Johnson, but wow! He had gone to Harry's and forgotten to take the phone. He was in such a hurry that he left his cell phone on the coffee table. Nothing. He will return. Call back. If he is in condition, of course, because conversations with Harry usually took place under a bottle of another beer. And even something stronger. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Paul Johnson. A few more minutes and it was him again. Susan wondered if it sounded like something important. Paul Johnson. She hadn't heard Mark mention him before. Maybe a new partner or a big client? What if it's someone from the company? A contract signing with which the spouse is just now celebrating. Either way, the man is pestering Mark with phone calls for a reason. He should probably take the phone to his spouse. Harry lives just across the street. And while Susan was thinking about it, Paul Johnson called again. This time, he didn't even take the previous interval. And Susan made up her mind. No, she wouldn't take the phone to Mark. He'd probably be drunk by now and start talking to Paul in slurred speech. Ruin everything else. No way. Susan would answer the phone herself and explain to the man that her husband had left the phone at home. He'll be back in the morning. Then he'll call back. That's better, and Susan took the call. She expected to hear the voice of a man of her age. He must be the same age as her husband, or even older. But the reality was quite unpredictable. Well, finally, a young woman's voice came over the phone. I call and I call, but you don't answer. I have a problem. It turns out that my passport has expired. You understand that our trip is disrupted. You had acquaintances there, so let them speed it up, or we won't have any Cyprus. Susan opened her mouth but couldn't answer. So she just listened in confusion, batting her eyes. What was happening was so incredible. Maybe someone just got the wrong number. Some strange mix-up happened. But the stranger's next words dispelled the last doubts. Mark, why aren't you talking? Have you swallowed your tongue? Susan sighed heavily. The woman called her husband by his first name. She is addressing him in such a masterly way. Incredibly, it seems that Mark is not at all what he seemed to Susan all this time. Who are you? Susan finally found the strength to engage in dialogue. Who are you? And why are you calling my husband? There was a short pause. The caller probably didn't expect to run into Mark's wife, but you have to hand it to her. She pulled herself together quickly. You want to know who I am? Asked the woman. Well, let Mark tell you that, he was going to, when the stranger hung up. Susan listened to the ringing tone for a while, and then she threw her husband's phone right into the wall. The screen broke, but the smartphone itself survived. Mark returned late, and Susan pretended to be asleep. She was lying on the living room couch, blanketed. She needed to gain strength before a serious conversation with her husband, and Mark was not in the best condition for such conversations. Her husband went up to the bedroom, and soon his snoring was coming from the room. But Susan had been turning from side to side all night. Sleep did not come to her. It was very scary to suddenly realize that the man who had been with you for more than half of your life whom you loved and trusted completely, was not at all who he claimed to be. Or maybe Susan had invented her own image of the perfect husband and stubbornly ignored his flaws and warning bells. In the morning, there was a serious conversation. Susan was all hesitant to start it, not even sure how to approach the subject. Mark unknowingly helped her. "Why are you so gloomy?" he asked his wife, spreading soft cheese on toast. "Why am I frowning?" Susan seemed to come out of her stupor. "There's a reason for that." "Which one is it?" Oleg asked. He still didn't suspect anything. "Reason's name is Paul Johnson." Oleg changed his face, put off his toast as if trying to find a comfortable position, tapped the table with the fingers of his left hand, but he was silent, lowered his eyes, and was silent. "Mark, explain to me what's going on," Susan demanded. "This woman said you've been meaning to tell me for a long time." "Sorry," Mark sighed heavily. "You probably won't believe me now, but you are still my closest and dearest person." "Of course I wouldn't believe it." Susan nodded affirmatively. "How can you believe such a thing after Paul Johnson's call?" "Her name is Jessica," Mark went on to explain. "It's all so complicated you can't just tell it like that. It's a long story. I'm not rushing anywhere." "I thought so. I knew that you would find out sooner or later. At first I wanted to stop everything, but I couldn't, and then it was too late, and I've been living between two fires for 12 years. 12 years old." Susan clutched her hands to the edge of the table so she wouldn't fall. Mark had been lying to her for so long. What kind of fool did she have to be not to notice? Mark got up from the table, opened the top flaps of the cabinet, pulled out a bottle of whiskey, poured it into his glass, dried it silently with one eye. Susan watched her spouse's nervous movements and was silent too. She was well aware that Mark was just gathering his courage. The woman knew her husband well, and she had no doubt he would tell her the truth, now for sure. "Jessica was a salesperson in one of my stores," Mark finally started. "Young, pretty, cheerful, always smiled at me so sincerely and friendly when I showed up at the store. She is much younger, she's in her 30s now, and back then she was just a girl. I never even thought about any of this, because Jessica is only 5 years older than Jill. But once it happened during a New Year's Eve corporate party. Mark tried to throw fun parties for his employees every time, renting a restaurant, ordering big treats, and hiring hosts. The man understood how important the team spirit is for the success of the business. Nothing strengthens it better than a joint holiday. Mark's mood that year was not cheerful at all. His beloved wife Susan was again welcoming the holiday in the hospital. Suddenly the illness that fell on the young woman dramatically changed the life of the happy family. It seemed that not long ago they were planning their second child, choosing a summer vacation destination, and now the whole life revolves around hospitals, medicines, doctors. Fortunately, the crisis is over, and this cannot but rejoice. At first, the doctor's prognoses were quite bleak, but Susan surprised everyone. She made it. When it became apparent, Mark breathed a sigh of relief. It was as if a mountain had been lifted from his shoulders, but it was too early to talk about complete victory. Susan was facing a long rehabilitation, endless examinations, and the final stage of treatment. She was still very weak and resembled a shadow of her former self. Mark desperately missed the Susan he had fallen in love with when he was very young. Cheerful, carefree, laughing. He wanted to go out to restaurants with his wife, sunbathe on the beach together, dance, travel, enjoy life, and talk to his wife about anything other than tests and medications and how she was feeling. No, Mark understood that this was just a phase of life, a test that they were almost through. There wasn't much left, but something told him that Susan had changed forever. There was no fire in her. She had become something too wise, very calm, predictable. The woman's eyes were now more and more directed inside herself. No, Mark still loved his wife very much. He had not even the slightest doubt about it. And yet, now his feelings for her were more like relatives. The man himself could not fully understand himself. He was tormented by questions. He was weighed down by new feelings when it became quite unbearable. Mark reminded himself that Susan was alive and would soon be almost completely healthy, and that was the most important thing. And yet sometimes he wanted to feel young, attractive, carefree again, forgetting for a while the problems and responsibilities to experience feelings at least remotely similar to those that had once arisen between him and Susan. And soon the opportunity presented itself. It happened right at that New Year's Eve party. Mark, as usual, sat at the head of the table and watched what was going on. The concert program was in full swing. The host turned out to be a professional. People were having fun. They were happily participating in contests, dancing. The tables were full of beautiful and tasty snacks, and champagne was pouring down like a river. The head of purchasing department sat on Mark's right. Chief accountant Jacqueline was on his left. All three were chatting about something. It was a light, pleasant conversation. Mark was in high spirits, the subordinates happy, cheerful, which meant that all the trouble of organizing the holiday was not in vain. And then, oh, how sweet Jessica was. Jacqueline shook her head, looking dreamily at the dance floor. Where are my 20s? It's hard to imagine it now, but I was the same way once. Pretty on the face, but too skinny, not really my type. The head of the procurement department gave his verdict. Mark followed his gaze and was dumbfounded. No, of course he had seen this girl more than once before. She had just recently taken a job as a salesperson in one of the stores, sort of like Jessica had been studying by correspondence and working. It was said that the girl had come from somewhere in the country to get an education. Tall, skinny, big eyes, long hair, she usually put it in a high ponytail. She always wore jeans and a t-shirt to work, so Jessica looked almost like a teenager, a pretty young creature with a snow-white smile. But today Jessica was very different. She was late for the event, or Mark would have noticed her from the beginning of the evening, because you just couldn't miss it. Jessica wore a small black sleeveless dress, beautifully fitting her figure, not too short but revealing her slender legs. Her long, shiny hair flowed down her graceful shoulders, and her eyes were accentuated by both mascara and shadow. Her eyes were accentuated by both mascara and shadow, her eyes shining like two diamonds. Also, Jessica moved magnificently. Her movements were free and uninhibited, but at the same time not at all defiant, an amazing sense of rhythm. She had a very subtle sense of music. It was immediately apparent. What fascinated, Jacqueline grinned understandingly. Careful, you know how sneaky these hillbillies are. Before you know it, they'll be leading you around. What do you mean? Mark grinned. She's a little older than my daughter. She's not a child, objected the head of the procurement department, the very age. For the rest of the evening, Mark looked at her surreptitiously, so his colleagues wouldn't see him admiring Jessica. These observations were a purely aesthetic pleasure to him. The girl was indeed good, very good, very good. Sometimes she caught his gaze, but she did not look embarrassed, but smiled warmly and openly back. She was generally very smiling and sociable. Mark decided to go home before the evening was over. He hadn't been drinking because he had an important meeting in the morning, so he arrived at the restaurant in his own car. What was the man's surprise when he found Jessica next to the car? The girl was wearing a light down jacket. She must have waited there for a while, but it was very cold outside. However, even her red nose and cheeks looked good on her. "What are you doing here?" Mark asked. And without waiting for an answer, he gestured to the girl to sit in the passenger seat. She was shivering with cold. She just needed to get into the cozy, warm interior now, or she would catch cold again. "I've been waiting for you." Honestly, Jessica confessed. "Me?" Mark was surprised. "But why?" "I'm an idiot." The girl lowered her eyes, the blood clinging to her cheeks, the blush making her young face even prettier and more attractive. "It just seemed to me that you were looking at me in a special way." "What about you?" "I've liked you for a long time, so I decided that. I'm sorry. It's no big deal." Mark smiled. He was incredibly flattered by such attention from a young girl. He still looked attractive in the eyes of young and beautiful people, and that couldn't be happier. "Can I take you home to where you live?" "Oh no, thank you." The girl was completely embarrassed. She opened the door and was about to jump out, but Mark gently held her hand. That touch, it decided everything. The next time it happened, Mark came to his senses. A happy smile played on her face, the girl gently stroking Mark's cheek. The man was in a slight shock of what had happened. This was something he had not expected from himself. What about Susan? She was lying in the hospital fighting for life, while her husband was having fun with young subordinates. Mark was overwhelmed with guilt. He'd betrayed his wife and brainwashed a young girl. Being in the role of a scoundrel is a real pleasure. "I love you," Jessica confessed, "and now I'm sure you have feelings for me too." Mark was determined that night that it was the first and last time. But now he couldn't stop thinking about Jessica. He was drawn to the girl like a magnet. She was so tender, so reverent, so young and beautiful. Jessica gave Mark everything he had missed for so long. With her, he felt young again, in love, and most importantly, alive. The affair, which had begun by accident, never ended. Mark bought Jessica a small apartment so she wouldn't have to rent anymore, and he also got her another job at his partner's mall. It wasn't enough that her co-workers would notice anything. Mark had carefully concealed the relationship. The most important thing was not to let the rumors get to Susan. The truth could ruin a woman barely out of the clutches of a serious illness. She hadn't noticed anything. The illness had changed her, made her detached, self-centered, even a little strange. She accepted her husband's constant absences, trusted his fishing trips and business trips, didn't ask too many questions, wasn't interested in Mark's life at all, and therefore such indifference was only to her husband's advantage. It was different with Jessica. She missed Mark, genuinely enjoyed his visits and gifts, and sometimes they flew away to the sea for a weekend and spent the weekend together, dancing till morning in local clubs, riding motorcycles, kissing in front of everyone. Mark knew the relationship had to end, but he couldn't give up on Jessica. No, he still loved Susan. His wife was truly his nearest and dearest and dearest. If Susan suddenly found out about Jessica and gave her husband an ultimatum, Mark would no doubt choose his spouse. He was well aware of that, and then things got even more serious. Jessica informed Mark that she was expecting a child with him. It was the first time the man was really scared. He even sent Jessica for an abortion, but she refused, became indignant, offended, cried. Mark apologized to her for a long time afterwards. In due time, Oleg became a father for the second time. His son Tyler was born, a wonderful boy, smart, cute, funny. In the same year, his daughter Jill also had a son, so Mark became a grandfather and father just a few months apart. Now Mark had a second family. Secret Jessica periodically gave the man scandals and scenes of jealousy. Now she was the mother of Mark's child and was entitled to a special relationship. Mark tried, bought Jessica and the baby a big apartment, transferred a substantial sum to his mistress's card every month, and then even helped the woman start her own flower business. He still enjoyed spending time with her. Jessica energized Mark and made him feel young and strong. And of course the man adored Tyler. He wished he could be with his son all the time. So on weekends, Oleg tried to give the child as much attention as possible. Mark was in a difficult situation. He could not and did not want to part with Susan and did not know what to do with his second family. He also loved Jessica and Tyler very much, and the man felt enormous guilt and to everyone involved in this difficult story. Now you know everything. Mark finally found the strength to look Susan in the eye. "I feel incredibly guilty before you. But now that you know the truth, I feel better, much better. I didn't expect it to be that way myself. I don't." Susan could hardly hold back her tears. Mark lowered his eyes. What could he say? That morning he packed up and left for work in silence, leaving Susan alone with her sad thoughts. The man himself looked depressed and frowning. Just before he left, he looked at his wife for a long time and told her that he loved her very much. Susan only shook her head, sorrowfully. She left her husband on the same day, called Lily beforehand, and sobbed, and told her best friend everything. She could not believe what had happened for a long time, and to the last minute she dissuaded Susan from leaving. He's lost his way. You know what I mean? Otherwise, he was a wonderful man. Remember how he pulled you out of your illness, how he fought for you, how he worried. Susan understood all this. Mark really was trustworthy, dear, close and loved. Yes, still loved even after all that had happened, but he had led a double life for 12 years, lying and twisting, and this masquerade fishing thing of his. How could he be trusted now? And there's a kid in that family, which means Mark's going to have to deal with him and this Jessica anyway. And Susan would have to put up with that. Oh, no. Susan packed her things and moved in with her daughter. The woman decided not to say anything yet. She explained the move by saying that her elderly mother needed help. It was partly true then, of course. Her daughter found out about everything. Mark told her himself. Susan had no idea what words he had chosen and how Jill felt, but she forgave her father and even met Tyler, her younger brother. Susan was glad that her daughter and father's relationship remained warm, as it should be. She herself felt crushed, abandoned, humiliated, and betrayed. Mark had tried to contact her, calling, texting, even catching her in the street, asking for forgiveness, begging her to come back, assuring her he couldn't live without Susan, but the woman just couldn't get over herself. The Mark she had once been in love with no longer existed. When was he gone? That first night when the cheating had happened, or later when the spouse had lied, twisted, invented endless fishing trips and business trips, pretended to be a faithful husband. Who cares, as long as Susan never went back to him? It was a deliberate and final decision. What a waste, grumbled Lily at her friend. Mark still loves you. It's very noticeable. So what if he helps the baby? So what? A lot of people live like that. It's not about the baby, Susan sighed. I mean, it wasn't just him. He'd been lying to me for so long, you know. He looked me in the eye and told me he was going fishing, and then he went to her, which was hard to take. Well, understand him. He was just confused. He was going through a difficult period. You both were going through a difficult period. So you succumbed to weakness, and then the next thing you know, you're on a roll. I still love him in my own way. We are forever family. We have a daughter, a grandson, but I can't live with him now, as if nothing had happened. Well, you should. Mark is about to bring Christine into the house, and she'll be wandering through your rooms and walking in your garden. Lily turned out to be right. After the dissolution of the marriage, which took place about a month after Mark's revelation, the spouse brought Jessica and the baby into the house. It was painful for Susan. It literally tore at her heart to think that strangers were now roaming around their family nest. People, but seemingly family favorites for Mark. The woman was very worried she was not enthusiastic. Nothing pleased her, even when she learned that Mark had generously signed away most of the joint property to her. Susan was not particularly happy. Life faded somehow, became gray. The woman existed on autopilot. The only thing that brought joyful emotions was communication with my grandson and daughter, but they lived far away. So they rarely saw each other, except for a Skype call every night. Jill, of course, noticed what was going on with her mother. Susan, in order not to disturb her daughter, tried to smile and speak in a cheerful tone, but the sensitive Jill was not fooled. She even shared her concerns with her father. He called, offered help. He found the best therapists, literally begged his ex-wife to visit these specialists. It was obvious that the man really cared about Susan. and his eyes were not those of a happy man. Although it seemed that Mark should now be in high spirits, how could he not be? His old wife was self-effacing. He was now living with the young and beautiful Jessica without hiding, and yet Mark didn't look so good. Maybe he could use a session with a therapist himself. Lily also tried to help her friend. She had already recovered from her fourth failed marriage. Another hope for a happy family life shattered by harsh reality. But the woman was not discouraged. She was not used to unexpected turns of fate. She did not regret anything. The only thing she lacked for full harmony was a child. Lily had never managed to become a mother, so she gave all her warmth to her goddaughter Jill. And now her son Matthew. More than once Susan thanked fate for having such a friend, delicate but at the same time decisive, clear and faithful, not indifferent. It was Lily who suggested the idea of a joint trip to the sea, but not to an elite foreign resort. No, Lily would not have enough savings for such a trip, and the woman would never agree to have the tickets paid for her by Susan. I'm used to foreign service. Tamara wasn't thrilled with the idea at first. There are beautiful beaches, polite people, clean hotels. Is that the main thing? Lily marveled. The setting itself, the friendly people, the delicious wine, the stunning sunsets, the special flavor. Let's make up our minds. Lily must have secretly worked Jill and Susan's mother because they suddenly began to convince both daughter and mother that she just needed to rest, and the woman gave in. Indeed, what was there to resist? She needed a change of scenery, and it would be better to go to a place that had nothing to do with Mark, and they had never been to local resorts, because at first there was not even enough money to live. And then, when the business began to bring profit, the couple regularly vacationed on foreign beaches where only they had not been. Susan and Lily took the train trip, and it turned out to be a very good decision. The pounding of the wheels, the changing scenery outside the window, the long conversations about everything, all this in itself was already psychotherapy and relaxation. Before she knew it, Susan had relaxed. They were staying in a guest house close to the beach. The beach was only a 10-minute walk away. The hospitable host generously served his guests homemade wine and told them stories about his region. It was obvious that he really loves his small motherland, and there was a reason for that. Lush greenery, endless beaches, mountains covered with forests. The local beauty was mesmerizing and healing. Susan couldn't get enough of this amazing air, and it was good that her friend had brought her here. Susan and Lily woke up early. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, and they hurried to the beach, which was not completely deserted at these early hours. They swam a lot, sunbathing in the morning and evening. They went on excursions or sat in cafes under the protection of umbrellas. Susan felt like she was coming alive again. Mark's betrayal was not the end of the world. There are many pleasant and interesting things in this world. One should not ruin oneself with gloomy thought. It is necessary to enjoy every moment, to admire the surrounding beauty, to communicate with nice people. During her illness, Susan clearly realized how precious the gift of life is, and realized that you need to consciously live every moment you are allowed. After what Mark had done, the woman had forgotten about it for a while, but now she realized the commonplace truth again. Life is won and to waste it on suffering. Resentment is just stupid. Lily was sincerely happy for her friend. It was just a wonderful vacation. And then, one evening on the pier, one tall, athletic man in a t-shirt and shorts, even dark tan, strong muscles standing out even under clothing, if it were not for light grey hair on the temples and a lifetime sagging. Look, he could be taken for a very young man, but it seemed that he was the same age as Susan and Lily. Good evening. He smiled radiantly at his friends. Hello, Lily answered. Tamara nodded politely. I've been watching you for a long time. You've been on vacation with us for about a week now. How do you like it? You bet. This time it was Susan who answered the stranger. I suggest you visit my cafe. It's a little farther out behind the pier. It's my treat, don't think anything of it. I just want to make sure you have a good impression of the place. Lily immediately agreed. Susan had no choice but to smile and nod affirmatively. The stranger introduced himself as Henry. As they walked across the beach to one of his cafes, the man said Henry had time to tell him that he had lived here for almost 5 years, having moved after sad events in his life there in his hometown. I'm from Oklahoma, by the way. Everything reminded me of the past. I wanted a distraction, a change of scenery, a new start in life. Susan understood the man very well. She herself had come here for the same thing, to be distracted, to have new experiences. Henry had lived on the coast for several months with his son, and one day they both decided they didn't want to leave. Henry sold the business in his hometown and used the money to buy a house here and start a new business. And I don't regret a thing. The man summed up his story. Every day, both my son and I are glad we made this decision. It's just a dream to live in such a place, by the way. So here we are. A small, cozy courtyard, a brick one-story building under a red roof. The place looked cozy and well-kept. It was clear at once that the owner loved the place and took care of it. There were not many visitors, and half of the tables on the terrace were empty. At one of them, a company of 3 people was seated. They were eating kebab and delicious salads, drinking all this with delicious wine. Conversation was slow and measured. Henry was a pleasant and interesting conversationalist. In the midst of the conversation, a boy ran up to the host, a teenager of about 12, dark-skinned, tall, thin, handsome and very touching, with his long arms and legs and thin neck. "Daddy, can I go to the beach with the boys?" "Okay, but by 6:00, I want you home." The boy raced outside to his friends. Susan wondered, this boy. He wasn't much older than her grandson, and yet the child called Henry Daddy. When the man talked about his son, Susan imagined a young man of at least 20 years. "This is my son, Joseph." Henry answered an unasked question. The late, long-awaited child was not immediately given to us by fate. It took some hard work. Henry then walked Susan and Lily all the way to their guest house. On the way, they laughed a lot, reminiscing about some incidents from their youth. The 3 of them had a lot in common. It seemed as if they were all old friends who hadn't seen each other for a long time, and so they accidentally met by the sea, but just outside the gate. Henry suddenly suggested that Susan meet up in the evening to go to the movies or take a walk on the beach. The woman didn't even immediately realize that she was being asked out on a date, because it had all been so long ago in some completely different life, and it seemed that it would never happen again. What kind of novels and dates at 50+ years old? And then all of a sudden it was like this. Susan looked at Henry. She didn't feel any particular sympathy for herself on his part. The man was equally friendly with both of them, so his proposal came as a complete surprise to her. "I don't even know." Tamara hesitated, but immediately received a rather tangible elbow to the side. "Of course she agrees." Lily smiled at Henry. "Pick her up at 7:00. Wouldn't you agree?" Henry looked at Susan questioningly. "True." I nodded my head. When they got to their hotel room, Lily was all over Susan with accusations. "Are you out of your mind? A man like that asks her out on a date, and she's thinking about it. It's just unexpected, like we've all been hanging out together, and now it's a date. You're still as out of this world as you are now." He was staring at you the whole time. I had no doubt that he was going to ask you out ever since we were invited to the cafe. "Really?" Susan was surprised. I hadn't noticed. At the appointed time, Henry waited for Susan at the gate. The woman hadn't been this excited in a long time. Surprisingly, she felt very young and very, very beautiful. It was a wonderful date. Henry gave Susan a tour of the neighborhood. She and Lily had never seen such beauty during their week's stay. Henry looked Susan in the eyes, gently held her hand, behaved very delicately and carefully, and at the same time the woman felt sympathy. Henry seemed to be seriously interested in her. Susan liked the man more and more, calm, judicious, attentive. Several hours flew by without her noticing it. It was getting dark, but neither Henry nor Susan wanted to leave. "You were surprised the other day at the cafe when you saw my son. I noticed that." Suddenly, the man said. They were sitting on a bench on the waterfront. Muffled music was coming from a nearby club, and the beach was full of well-dressed people, mostly young people, happy, free, beautiful. To be honest, yes, I was surprised. "I really like you. I want you to know about me. It's all going to be honest." Susan realized that some frank story was about to follow, and she experienced anxiety. Maybe Henry would tell her something about himself that would disappoint her. Maybe the romantic tale would disappear in a few moments. Henry talked about the country, the story fascinating Susan more and more. She was curious to know the truth about the man who had somehow managed to be special to her in just a few hours of acquaintance. Henry's story was somewhat similar to her own as well, at least in the beginning. Henry had met his future wife at university. They were in different departments, but they often crossed paths at numerous student events. Diana struck the guy with her love of life and strong character, and of course an important role was played by the attractive appearance of the guy. Diana at first did not pay any attention to the ardent admirer, laughed at his confessions, ignored invitations to date, and later found out the reason for such behavior. She liked Henry, really liked him, but he had a reputation as a local joker and jester at the time, so she thought that all his confessions were made for the sake of humor, for the amusement of the audience. When everything fell into place, Henry experienced great joy and relief. He and Diane began to date. The young couple married right after graduation and lived in a small apartment that Henry inherited from his grandmother. They worked, met friends, dreamed of a happy future. They did not have enough money at first, but everyone around them lived exactly the same. On the contrary, young people even considered themselves lucky. After all, they had their own apartment, may it be small. May it need repairs, but it was their own. Of course, Diane and Henry at one point thought about having children. It seemed so easy. They wanted a child. And here it is. Get it and sign it. But in their case, it was completely different. Time passed. The pregnancy did not come. Diana went to doctors to find out the reason, but the medicine of the time, especially the free one, left much to be desired. The doctors shook their hands. They could not understand why a young and seemingly healthy woman could not become a mother. Some suggested waiting, some advised resignation, but most of all surprised Professor, to whom Diana once miraculously got an appointment. She had so much hope for him, except that the professor recommended that the patient go to some witch doctor grandmother, since the traditional treatments did not work. The couple went to the grannies. It happened. They waved candles over Diana's head and forced her to take some dubious remedies. The young woman was ready to do anything to feel the joy of motherhood, but there was no effect. Henry, like Mark, lost his job around the same time period. Diane's paychecks at the factory began to be delayed. What kind of a child is that? He would survive. And that's when Henry started his own business, and he was luckier than Mark. He got it right the first time. It was an atelier that repaired and sewed clothes. At first, the atelier workers were Diana and Grace, Mark's wife and sister. He was in charge of everything else. Henry realized then that if he hadn't been laid off because of the recession, he would have been working in his factory for a pittance, working from dawn to dawn and saving his wages for a summer vacation. It is unlikely that he would have thought to start their own business, but when he had nowhere to go, he had to look for a solution to the problem, and the solution was quite unexpected. Over time, the small atelier became a full-fledged factory, bringing a good profit. Henry became a successful entrepreneur. It was not Diane and Grace who had long worked for him, but a whole staff. His sister and wife were now in charge of purchasing and sales. Accordingly, Henry adored his offspring. But even more, of course, he loved and appreciated Diana. It broke his heart to see his wife unhappy. Yes, Diana had a lot of money, travel, a big, beautiful house, but the main dream of her life remained unfulfilled. Diana still hadn't become a mother. Henry, of course, also dreamed of a son or daughter, but the lack of heirs did not make him unhappy. Victor had a business, had friends and relatives, had a beloved woman. All this was quite enough to feel like a man of substance, but Diana needed a child. When the family had money, the couple could finally afford a quality checkup. That's when the unsettling truth came out. Diane was diagnosed with serious heart problems. They did not show themselves, but if suddenly a pregnancy occurred, the woman would be unlikely to survive. A wise body seemed to understand this and would not allow conception. "You're very lucky that you never got pregnant," the doctor concluded. Henry came to the appointment with his wife at the time. He was by her side, holding her hand. Diane cried for hours after that visit. Henry felt helpless. He had no idea how to help the person he loved. He even offered to adopt the baby, but Diana wanted her own. As time passed, Diana seemed to have come to terms with her diagnosis. She was smiling again. She had desires and plans. The man rejoiced, watching the beloved person returning to normal life. And now, when they were both over 40, the incredible thing happened. Diane finally got pregnant. She reported the news to her husband, her eyes shining, her face shining with a smile. Henry had never seen his wife so happy, but the man himself was frightened. He remembered the doctor's words that Diane should not give birth. It was dangerous for her life. But Diana, on the other hand, seemed oblivious of all the warnings. When Henry gently hinted to his wife that the pregnancy might have to be terminated, it was such a risk. Diane seemed to be off the chain. She yelled at her husband, called him selfish, and even threw at him the objects that fell within her reach. Henry had never imagined that his wife could do such a thing. The man turned away from the objects flying at him and tried to convince Diane that he was very afraid of losing her. The woman quickly came to her senses and apologized. "I know the risk," Diana said, looking at Henry, "but I've dreamed of having a baby, our own child, for so long that I can't give up this gift. Do you understand?" Henry nodded. He understood, but he still hoped to change Diana's mind before it was too late. She was too dear to him to risk her life, even for the sake of their mutual child. Man took attempt after attempt to gently convince his wife, described in detail the possible consequences, but Diane remained adamant. She enjoyed every moment of her difficult pregnancy, and pregnancy was not easy. There were many reasons for that. Diane's age, her state of health. The woman was often in the hospital. She was watched by the best doctors, and still Henry's heart clutched with anxiety. The bigger the belly became, the worse Diane felt. By the end of her term, she was no longer getting out of bed. And yet she assured her husband that she had never felt so happy. One day at another board meeting, it was decided to perform a cesarean operation on Diana, but it was not yet due. But any delay could have cost the life of both the baby and his mother. On a beautiful summer morning, Henry finally became a father. He was the first to take the baby in his arms, an emotion that overwhelmed him at that moment, impossible to convey in words. The man looked at the baby's wrinkled face, and his heart melted with tenderness. Diana was too weak and busy to support the child. She lay on the couch without strength and smiled, the man she loved holding her beloved son in his arms. "How happy I am." Alice barely survived. A couple of hours after giving birth, she was taken to the intensive care unit. For several days, the young woman was between life and death. Henry even turned gray during this period. He was torn by conflicting emotions, the joy of becoming a father and the fear for his wife. He was even angry at tiny Joseph. Yes, angry and blaming the baby for what he had done to Diana. Then, of course, Henry berated himself for such thoughts. The son, of course, was not guilty of anything. Diana had pulled through then, partly because of quality medical support, partly because of a great desire to raise the long-awaited child herself. But her heart problems had worsened. If previously the defect hardly bothered the woman, now it made itself felt very brightly and often. Diane even changed her appearance. She lost weight, became grey. Now there were always shadows under her eyes, and her lips had acquired an unnatural shade. The woman became a regular client of the hospital. The child was taken care of by babysitters, and by the father, of course. Henry worked hard but tried to spend enough time with his son. Joseph grew up to be a bright and serious boy. From an early age, he was considerably ahead of his peers, was much more mature and responsible, and all because the child was used to watching his mother, to notice the signs of an approaching attack and immediately report his suspicions to his father. The boy knew what pills to give his mother, and when to give them, he even asked the doctor to teach him how to give injections. He wanted to be prepared for anything. Joseph, from the age of 5, had no doubt that he would become a doctor, and now the boy did not change his dream. When Joseph was 7 years old, Diana was once again taken by ambulance, but the young woman was never taken to a hospital. Yes, she was able to become a mother, but at what cost? Henry was inconsolable. Diana replaced the whole world for him. Henry was kept on this earth only by the need to raise his son. Joseph had lost his mother. What would happen to the boy if he lost his father as well? It's frightening to imagine. I couldn't be in that town. I couldn't take care of the factory anymore, because once we started this business together with Diana, everything reminded me of her and hurt me. So I made that decision, took my son and went to the sea. I thought for a while, but we didn't want to leave here, so we stayed longer. Henry opened a small cafe on the coast, then another, and now he owned a whole chain of catering establishments. There were plenty of customers, especially, of course, in the summer. But during the year, the cafes were also in demand. There were sanatoriums and ski resorts in the area, so there was no shortage of tourists looking for a bite to eat. Henry's story struck Susan. It was not easy for him, and yet the man found the strength to start life anew. An inspiring example. What else can I say? Susan never went home with Lily. She escorted her friend to the train, waving through the window. Henry was by her side, helping Lily with her bags. After that, Henry and Susan drove to the house, which in a few weeks had already become the woman's home. They were met at the threshold by Joseph. The boy was smiling. "I cooked meat with the new recipe," he told those who came in. "Let's go taste it." Once again, Tamara was surprised at how mature and sensible this teenager is for his age. A real little man, and at the same time so fragile, so vulnerable, he needs care and affection. Now, Susan lives in a resort town in a big house with a beautiful garden, which she herself has decorated. She feels loved and also protected. Henry is the stone wall that every woman dreams of. He values their relationship, keeps it safe. And Joseph, he is so drawn to Susan. You can see that the boy has been sorely missing his mother all these years. A loving father is good, but no one can replace a mother. Susan didn't try to. It just somehow happened by itself that she felt tenderness and love for Joseph. Once she had dreamed so much about having a son, running to doctors, trying to figure out the diagnosis, and now she had a son in the most unusual way. They needed each other. It was obvious. Jill rejoiced at the change in her mother's love life, and upon meeting Henry and Joseph, fully approved of Susan's choice, and Mark's life didn't go through the best of changes. Jessica has found a wealthier man, charmed her partner Mark from Italy. He, according to mutual friends, fell head over heels in love with the young woman and took her to his homeland, along with his son, of course. So Mark is now bereft of both woman and child. The parting with Tyler was particularly hard on the man. Lily told Susan that there was just no face on Mark. The best part was that Jessica didn't go into her new life empty-handed. She took over some of Mark's property, including the house in which Susan had once been so happy. Susan genuinely felt sorry for her ex-spouse. Even now, after their conversation about her grandson's birthday, the woman felt a slight sadness. Mark sounded so sad. It must have been very lonely and frustrating for him to have lived with two families for 12 long years, and then suddenly to lose everything and be completely alone. Something you wouldn't wish on your enemy. Don't worry, it's his own fault. Lily, as always, was on her friend's side. She often came to stay with Susan for a week at her dearest person's house and to enjoy the warm sea waves and the beautiful local scenery at the same time. Mark had a choice. He made it. He did it himself, so let him reap the rewards now. And yet I feel a little sorry for him. Susan shook her head. Don't feel sorry for him. He's not old. He's got money. He's a successful entrepreneur. Do you know how many other Jessicas are hanging around him? They'll pick him up, comfort him. Comfort him. He's a man like that. Tamara knew her friend was right. Time would pass, and Mark would pull himself together and get his life together. He had always been strong and determined, and he could handle it now. Now it was time to think about organizing a party for her grandson. Jill said they would be arriving in 3 days, and there was a lot to do. Decorating the garden, hiring an animator, sending out invitations to Matthew's friends. He's got a lot of them, and he's a sociable little boy, and he's not that little. He's 8 years old. How does time fly? Joseph volunteered to help Susan with the birthday arrangements. The woman saw that the teenager enjoyed all this trouble as much as she did. How nice to have such a helper and like-minded person around. Henry made Susan truly happy, changed her life and destiny. What luck that they had met back then.